Time with Stephanie Storey.
Hi, I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Story Time, where I get to talk to other writers and storytellers about their passions and processes. My guest today, I'm very excited to talk to her. She is not only the author of books like Girls Sent Away, Sea Escape, and Life Without Summer, but she is also a family counselor. So I'm really interested to hear how these worlds collide in her novel writing world. Her latest, just out, it's called Dangers of an Ordinary Night. Please welcome to the show, Lynne Reeves Griffin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for us to talk about all things books.
I'm excited about this conversation, except there's going to be too much to talk about. We're going to have to cram it all in. Okay, before we start, please tell my viewers at home about this latest book. You were always sort of traditionally a sort of women's fiction writer, and now suddenly, boom, you write a suspense. What pulled you in? What is the story about? And sort of why did you have to tell it?
Well, I started off the story as I start off all of my stories, which is that I really wanted to examine a family issue that nobody wants to talk about. And so I knew that this story was going to be about the impact of addiction on families, particularly on marriage and parenting. And before I knew it, the story was really like a rocket. It had a lot of twists and turns, and it was telling me that it was a different energy than other stories I had written. And so before I knew it, I realized it was domestic suspense. So at the heart of the story, there's an abduction of two girls outside a performing arts high school in Boston. And 2 days later, the girls are found. One is alive and one is not. And the teenager who comes back to her family has to really reacclimate and really contend with the trauma. But at the end of the day, we have to figure out what happened to these girls. And so lots of people step in to try to figure that out. And as they do, all of their family secrets come tumbling out. And we find out that maybe none of them are involved, or maybe all of them are.
Oh, I love a good suspense. And I love family secrets. Because I think every family has secrets somewhere about something, whether they're small or whether they're big. And so I'm always fascinated by them. But my first question is, so do you like the suspense? Are you going to write more of it? Did you enjoy the pace of it and the crazy? Or were you like, this is just a once in a lifetime story that I wrote?
I think it's where I'm going to land for a little while.
Really?
Yeah. This was a 2-book deal. So I have another book right behind it, which is unusual for me. There's usually a number of years between my books, say 4 or 5 years between books. But I sold this as a 2-book deal because I was already in the process of writing another suspense story. And so that one's coming out next year, Dark Rivers to Cross.
Oh my God. So you're like me in that usually I have a lot of time between my novels because I take a lot of time to craft them because I like to sit down in it and to let it grow and let it change. But this one came out so quickly. You did a 2-book. That's crazy, right?
It is crazy. It is crazy. But again, I feel like it's the energy of this genre for me. It writes itself faster in a sense because the pace is faster. It's almost like when I'm in the writing experience of it, I'm feeling that same energy that the characters are. Yeah.
I'm like, someone's going to die if I don't finish this.
Kind of, yes. And so it's enjoyable in that sense. And also which is good in a way, because some of the issues are heavier. I've always had a grief through line in my work. I think that it isn't as a writer until you're a few novels in that you find out what your voice is as a writer. And I'm not talking about the voice of your characters, because to me that's different. All of your characters should have their own voices and sound like real people. But your voice as a writer, in my mind, is what do you keep revisiting? What are you trying to continue to resolve? And all of my stories have a grief through line. And I had a traumatic grief experience when I was a teenager. My father died quite young. And he was, healthy, and my family was happy, and it came out of the blue. And I think I keep trying to revisit some of those themes to continue to keep understanding it on a different level. So I think my voice as a writer is to always be looking at those family issues that people have trouble talking about and those grief through lines.
Now, okay, so which came well, I guess the grief in your own life came first.
Mhm.
And so then you become a family therapist, or did you become, where did the journey take you on the exploring this through family therapy and helping other people cope with their family issues, right? And their grief and their stuff versus doing it through books, which is a different way to help people, but also seems like a different way to help yourself
Yes.
understand those issues, right? What was that journey like for you as a person?
I think you're right on target here, that it's, which came first and how tangled are they? I think they're deliciously tangled, to be honest. I would say that what in high school and college, what I had wanted to do was I had wanted to go to school for theater arts. I was an actress in high school and college, and I really cared a lot about storytelling, but on the stage. And that was not encouraged for me. So I went the traditional route, like a good girl. I did what I was supposed to do, and I went to nursing school. So I started off my career as a nurse, and I worked in all the major teaching hospitals in Boston. And I eventually found my way to working with families and doing a lot of teaching and writing about families. And then I opened my own practice and I started seeing families. And one of the things that I realized is that everybody has a story, and those stories are very thematic. And people in therapy are really working through their own narrative, the story they tell themselves. And I knew that that creative side of my life was really, those needs weren't being met. I love what I do. I adore working with families. I love working in schools. I love working with teachers and kids. But there was a creative side of me, that theater girl, who wasn't getting those needs met. So I started writing fiction for myself, actually. And I had no intention of it being published. I just wrote it because I needed an outlet that was creative. And one thing led to another. And now this is novel 4. So
One thing leads to another, and you
One
keep
thing
writing
leads-
them somehow, right?
Yes,
Okay.
you just have to be open to the process, and it's convoluted. My career is a winding road, to say the least, but it's terrific, and they inform one another.
That's what I started to say. Yeah, it seems on the surface like a winding road. Like so many of us have these like weird careers that take you all over the place and it looks all disconnected. But when you look back on it, is it really so disconnected? Because even you were talking about the narratives that people tell themselves in therapy. That's what storytelling is, right? At its bones, whether you're talking about a novel or if you're in a play, if you're watching a movie, whatever, all story is about us trying to make sense of our lives as humans, right? So
Yes.
you write a lot about family issues in your novels. I mean, I know you're not going to go back and steal someone's direct story, but could you have written the novels that you wrote without that long of time being a therapist? I mean, it had to have informed the way you saw story and told it like crazy. Like, can you just talk about some of that? Because I'm so
Sure.
fascinated by how those two things meld.
Yeah, I would say that I couldn't possibly write Dangers of an Ordinary Night 10 years ago. I couldn't write Dark Rivers to Cross, last year. I feel like where you are is what you bring to the table. And I think that as readers can sometimes engage with a novel and it clicks for them, or they might not like something at first, but then they revisit it years later and say, oh, this is perfect for me now. I think that experience is the same for the writer, which is you're not ready to tell certain stories, or you're not capable of telling certain stories until you are, right? But I would say that the whole family therapy thing is absolutely, without question, people talking story. And I am informed by that universality, the themes that keep showing up person to person to person. In this particular novel, I explore high pressure parenting. And we are clearly in a stage right now where there's a lot of pressure on parents to be the best kind of parent they can be, but also to push their children to be successful. And I try to explore that through the multiple voices that I hear in my practice. But I always assure my clients, and I always revisit this when I'm promoting a novel, nobody is in my story. These are all people that are made up from my own imagination, and they become very real to me. So Nell and Fitz and Sin, who are the 3 main characters in this story, they are characters, but they are three-dimensional and real to me. And they are not like anyone else I know. They're a little bit me. They're a little bit of research I've done. They're a little bit of how they've evolved on the page. But I never use client stories.
Of course. And that's why I sort of mentioned that right off. It was like, I know you're not, I know that about therapists, which is good. You shouldn't be, but just the idea that they would inform you. You said something interesting during that answer, which is you can only write where you are. So this book came out this fall. Now I know the process of book publishing is so long. So I don't know when you finished the physical writing or revision of this work in comparison to Ye Olde Pandemic. But I know you're writing a new one that has to be informed by it. So where did this sort of fall in that timeline, particularly since you're dealing with pressure parents and you're dealing with grief, that changes so much of our perspective. Either how did it affect this book and how is it affecting your next book? Because it changed my writing. So like, I'm freaking out. Like the next one, I'm having a meltdown over the next one because the pandemic changed me so much. I can't write the book I was planning on writing. That's ridiculous.
That's right. And it's absolutely true, which I think is a good thing, because that means we're growing and we're learning and we're trying to be flexible with how we observe the world and how we incorporate those ideas. It's a new reality. We now live differently. And so we have to be taking that into consideration. The Dangers of an Ordinary Night was finished in 2018. But then when I sold it in 2020, I had a little bit of revision to do, as one does when you work with an editor. So once the editor comes on board, you get a new, fresh perspective and you do some more editing. So I would say I was in the edit stage. And since the book does not take place in the pandemic, I thankfully did not have to include all of those details. And the other novel that I also sold, the one that's coming out next year, that one actually takes place in a multiple time frame, but the latest it goes is 2012. So thankfully no pandemic information needed to work its way in there as well.
Right, but like I'm a historical, like I read about people 500 years ago. There's not actual pandemic crap I have to be dealing with, thank goodness. But emotionally, my viewpoint on stuff has shifted so much over the last year and a half. So I guess that's what I'm asking. It's not like the physicality of dealing with the pandemic. I get it. I feel badly for contemporary writers who have to do that. Right. But how has it affected the way you're approaching your stories and has it changed the way you've thought about storytelling, or you've thought about the topics you're dealing with? Has it shifted that, I guess?
Not necessarily, though I have to say there was a little bit of prescience involved with The Dangers of an Ordinary Night, because one of the things that I do explore in that is that in the face of addiction in a partnership, what happens to the person who is not struggling? So what about the person who's in the shadow of the addiction? And so I got into a lot about the role that women take on as caretakers for their partner, as caretakers for their children. And how do they do that in some ways in the absence of their own identity? And of course, that's exactly what happened in the pandemic for women, was that they came on as, okay, suddenly now I'm a teacher, now I'm a healthcare person, now I'm all of these roles, and my own job and my own career and my own sense of self took a back seat. And so a lot of women who've read it and have shared with me the idea that this caretaker theme is there in the novel, though not related to the pandemic, is something they can really relate to, because that's what's happened.
So if you were a theater girl at heart, how is noveling different and yet the same as the theater? Because I'm started training as an actor when I was in my late 30s, and I was like, at first I thought, oh, these are two completely different worlds. And since then I've learned, oh no, they are so very similar. But how has it been the same? How has it been different? How has your storytelling experience differed between writing on the page and acting in the theater?
Right. Well, without question, I can point to one thing that's pretty dramatic. And that is that for an actor, you have to always be front and center with your character's motivation. So in theater, you don't walk on a stage unless you absolutely know what's driving you. And all of the dialogue comes from a drive to accomplish something. And even if you're walking on stage just to, move a prop or to engage in a connection with a character before doing something else, it's motivation driven. And in fiction, that's key too, because without a central conflict of your characters, you don't have what playwrights call that dramatic unifying action, the thread that pulls the whole story together. So theater has informed that in my fiction in a really big way. And I actually, with the writers that I work with, I actually teach them that theater piece to inform their fiction, because that's what central conflict is. It's the thread that pulls the whole piece together. It's what your characters are after. It's what they need. And theater does that so beautifully.
Theater does that so well. And I so agree. Every actor, you've got to know. I didn't know what really the words point of view meant in that until I started taking acting. I'm like, oh, everybody has such a point of view about everything. They have a they have something they want. That's what you're going after. And when you start putting it into your fiction, it changes that.
It does.
So dramatically.
Without question. I think it's the difference between a piece of work that can keep the reader turning those pages, because they really, whether they like that person or don't, whether that character frustrates them or not, they still want to see if they get what they're after, right? That's what they're turning the pages for. Not just because you have beautiful writing and not just because you can set a scene, but that because they really want to know, is that character going to get what they want and need, and what are they willing to do to get it? And again, that comes directly from the theater and central conflict.
Is that easier in suspense? Because that automatic thing of there's death, someone could die. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah, because there's more at stake in suspense, right? So in domestic suspense, when you're looking at the psychology of people and people feeling unsafe physically or unsafe emotionally or unsafe relationship wise, well, then there's a lot at stake, right? And so when there's a lot of at stake and you turn up the dial on that, I want and need this partly because I'm so unsafe. Yeah, that energy helps you to keep those pages turning. And you can't flag, because the other thing that I've learned is that even if you have a really good psychological family story, readers of the genre are expecting certain conventions. And just as a historical novelist, your readers are expecting certain conventions. And yes, you can bend and twist them. You can genre bust a little, but you still can't disappoint.
Yes, I agree with that. I started to say I sometimes push the genre busting a little bit too far, which has been both my it's been the best thing about my books and the hardest thing, right? Because it's well, where do you fall into that? But I think you're right about the disappointing.
Yes.
If you're going to bend, it needs to be a positive surprise for the people who are invested in that genre.
Exactly. And I think that first and foremost, it's important for me to write the story that I need to write and explore the social issues and the psychology that I want to explore. But at a certain point in revision, I turn my attention to the reader and I say, okay, now I have to pay attention in revision to the reader's experience. It was one thing from my experience, and that's important. And I want to be satisfied as a writer, but at some point I have to turn my attention to the readers. Now, not to the point where I am disingenuous to what I'm trying to create. I still have to be true to myself. I don't want to give the reader what they want at my own expense, if you will. But at the same time, I have to satisfy both of us, because we're in a partnership. A novel is a partnership. It's between the reader and the writer. And the writer should disappear a little bit, right? We should be in the background.
But if you flipped that process, it would fall apart, right? If you wrote the first draft for the reader and then you went back through and tried to put yourself into it, it would crumble, wouldn't it?
I agree. Because the art is first and foremost coming from you. Yeah. Of course it is, yeah. Right? And it doesn't matter whether you're a poet or an actress or a short story writer. The art is coming from you. It's somewhere in your own experience and your own inspiration. And so it has to start there, I think.
So you said you're 4 books in.
Yes.
And grief has been this steady thing. in large part because you struggled with this huge grief when you were young, and that takes over a life, or it can.
It
How
does.
has your relationship with grief changed over the writing of the 4 books? Because each book, I'm sure you struggled with something, or you moved a little bit, or you changed. I always feel like every time I write a novel, I come out the other side like, oh, that's apparently what I was trying to do when I wrote that novel. Who knew? And you don't know until you're done. So
Yeah.
how has your relationship with grief changed over the course of the 4 books, and specifically with
Sure.
Dangers of an Ordinary Night?
I think it matches how old I was and what I was grappling with. So for my first novel, I was a new mother, and my children were young, and so I think my grief was tied to fear. I wrote about the loss of a child, and I think that my grief was related to, okay, I've been through this thing that I know can happen, right? I used to live in this perfect little world where nothing bad happened, and then suddenly something bad could happen, and it did happen, and it happened to me. So then grief became about fear. I don't want to be experiencing the next thing I'm afraid of that's related to grief. And then as I moved along in novels, I think I became more comfortable with grief, more at home with it. And now I'm willing to let my characters sit inside it and see what it has to say. And in this particular novel, I would say that that's my goal. I really want readers to be okay that there are some things that are impossibly difficult to talk about, and addiction is one of them. And yet there is hope and healing if you can, and if you do, and if you tell people you're struggling. And if you are not the person who's got the addiction, but you're the person in the shadow, that you can ask for help too. You don't have to keep it a secret. You don't have to pretend it's not happening, because it's happening, right? And when we are in connection with other people, we always do better. So I think now I'm kind of making friends with grief a little bit, if you can imagine that, and letting myself and my readers imagine that there's a way to come in it and come out of it.
That is very difficult work. I mean, like personally, that is just, it's really difficult work to get to that, because it's so hard. You want to control everything. You want to control life, and you want to make it the way you want to make it. And it's very difficult to let go of that. And here you are.
Well, I'm going to just raise my hand here and say, I'm not very good at it. So don't be thinking wait a minute here. I said that's what I was trying to do. I didn't say.
And encouraging other people to do, but whoa.
Yes. I don't know if you can ever get to mastery on that, right? I think we're always going to be a work in progress. I think you were right when you said that grief can take over a life, because even though I was 15 when I lost my father, I mean, I've matured, I have a healthy, happy life. It doesn't change the fact that my point of view is forever altered. But I'm still healthy, and I still have nice relationships, and life is grand. But I'm forever changed by it. And I think that one of the things that I try to do in my fiction is allow my characters to engage in situations where they may too be forever changed. And yet there can still be lots of blessings and lots of grace and lots of healthy relationships if they're willing to not keep secrets. I think that's the other thing I keep returning to is people who keep secrets, people who close themselves off from the people they love the most. Why do we do that?
Well, I don't know, but also secrets just make for good stories.
They really do.
Now you care deeply about this stuff, this writing stuff, this story stuff. I can see it all over you when you talk about it, which is great. But B, I see it in your life, right? From the theater thing to the novel writing thing. And you've referenced this already. You teach, you try to share all of this information with other writers. You said, yeah, when you were a kid, theater mattered, but do you know why storytelling means so much to you, just as a human, not as a therapist, just as a person? Do you know why it's so important to you to deal with and to share with other people?
Yeah, I have to say, I think I was born that way because I'm really a dramatic person. So, I mean, my father was calling me a dramatic person when I was a little girl. So, I think at one point, I remember him saying to me when I was little, he said, "Oh, come here, my little Sarah Bernhardt." And I was like, "Who's that?" And he said, "The greatest actress the world has ever known." So I already knew that I was kind of intense and sensitive and dramatic. I had a grandmother who was like that. She was just, she was a storyteller through and through, and I could really connect to her. So I think there's something to do with the hardwiring here. I love story. I could read for days on end. I could never get enough. It's like that, your to be read shelf that just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and there's no chance you're ever going to get through it, right? But it doesn't matter. It feels great.
So I always feel like whenever I write a new novel, whether they're actually published or they're tucked away in filing cabinets, right? Because I have like 7 that will never see the light of day because boy, they are bad. Um, but every time I finish one, I feel like I learned something. We already talked about what you learned as a human. I always learn something as a writer. So even if you're done, even if you only write 2 suspense books, and then let's say at some point you go back to women's fiction or you go back to some other genre and you leave suspense, what's the craft thing you're going to take from suspense and apply it in a new way to everything you ever write moving forward? Is there anything that you grabbed from it like that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that it's what's at stake. So if you're in domestic suspense or if you're in thriller or mystery, there's something very big at stake. And you have to know what that is. And that has to rise. That has to really escalate over time. But I think the same is true if you're writing a short piece of fiction, or if you're writing, any kind of genre, historical or anything else. You have to know what's at stake. And so even though the stakes maybe don't have to have the dial turned so high as it is in domestic suspense, you still have to have it, and it still has to fit the piece. So I think it's what's at stake.
Yeah, that's the lesson so many writers need, right? To dial it up, to make it, to keep people from going to bed at night. My favorite compliment is, "I'm mad at you because I couldn't go to sleep because I had to finish the stupid book." I'm like, yes.
Yes, I actually got it. I got an email from a reader actually, who told me that she started my book at night and she went to bed really, really late. And then she went to work and she ducked out to get a coffee so she could keep reading, and she got in trouble. And I was like, "I'm sorry you got in trouble at work, but I'm a little happy."
You're a lot happy. Are you kidding? You're like, yes, this is the greatest story I've ever heard. Okay, one final thing. So you're working on it on your second of the suspense. It's going to be coming out quickly. So that one's got to be almost done. Do you already know what the next thing is? Is it already on the horizon, or are you still a little trying to figure that out?
I'm in the dabbling stage. So I know what who my characters are, and I know what my social issue is, but I do not have a draft. So that novel is definitely in the early stages.
Okay, one more quick question on that though, for my writers at home who are still learning. When you're in that phase, how do you know when it's time to leave that phase and actually get to the writing of the draft? How do you know when the dabbling for you, when the dabbling part is it's done and now you're just procrastinating instead
Right.
instead of actually setting to work?
Yeah.
Have you figured that out? How do
I
you
have. My writing process is all the research I do on the psychological issue that I want to explore, the social issue. I do all of that research. I read a ton. I interview people. I really kind of immerse myself in it. And when I start hearing things that I already know, then I know I've already finished my research, because now I don't need to hear it again. I've already internalized that. If I hear something for the 10th time, then I know that that's a universality that I'm going to have to hit on. And also when I know what my character's central conflict is. So when I know what they're struggling with, like in The Dangers of an Ordinary Night, there are 3 points of view. There's a mother, a psychiatrist, and a detective, and they all struggle with a little bit of the same thing, which is they've each been betrayed by someone, and they're having a very difficult time trusting people again. And it's a little bit different person to person, but they're each struggling with that. So it just keeps layering itself forward. And when I knew I had that, then I knew I needed to get down to business.
I could have talked to you for a really, you're fantastic. You know so much. You're so And you're so great at explaining this for people. I'm so excited to be able to share this with some of my own students who are struggling with all of this stuff and trying to figure all of this stuff out.
Well,
And
thank you. It
learn.
was effortless to speak with you too, because you're right there in the same. We're doing the same thing.
We're
So
all doing the same. Somehow we're all muddling through, Lynn. I don't know how. I'm not sure.
where does that persistence come? I don't know, but you need it. You definitely need it.
You got to be really stubborn.
Yep.
Story time with Stephanie.
Exactly.
Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie. Story